You are warmly welcome to join us for this significant roundtable. We are very fortunate to have such a wonderful combination of panelists. We have Lady Zhao Yan, Lady Feng Xue, and then we have Confucius, Fei Fei, and then we have Confucius. But actually, it's a pity that we could not get Confucius Institute directors on board. We have been trying very hard for 2 months. We actually exhausted our avenues, try to invite some directors of Confucius Institute to join us, but somehow we failed. Originally, we get Professor Mopo Gao from Adelaide University. He initially agreed to come, but later dropped out. I feel sorry for that. It will run like this. Each speaker will speak about 10 to 15 minutes, roughly 10 minutes. And then we'll leave more time for Q&A. We know that there are 14 Confucius Institutes in Australia and 62 Confucius classrooms in the schools. Somehow, about a couple weeks ago, in a private conversation with the Minister of Education in New South Wales, he told me that the Confucius classrooms in New South Wales has been indefinitely suspended for the time being. I don't know what will be the consequence after that, but currently all lie down. Some Confucius Institute in the United States or in Canada has been shut down. I think we need to, it's a good time for us to start the debate on the Confucius Institute as well as Confucius classrooms in Australia, whether to continue or support or have other options. Tonight I will invite, according to good customs in Australia, invite the ladies to speak first. So the first speaker will be Ms. Zhao Yan from University of South Queensland. Right. Ms. Zhao is a professional teacher, expert in teaching Chinese language and culture for over 3 decades in Australia. Although not necessarily in Confucius Institute. So let's join hands to welcome Mr. Zhao first.
Thank you very much, Professor Feng. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Feng and all the coordinators of this magnificent event, at which we're going to discuss something very important, which I believe is very important and acutely relevant to what is happening in Australia. And before I start, I would like to make a few points clear. The first is, I'm not expert on the studied Confucius Institutes or classrooms, but I'm very concerned academic. I'm very concerned about the aggressive infiltration of the Chinese Communist Party's culture into the system of the Western community and in our Australian education system. And I think we need to be aware of what is happening behind harmless, what people seem harmless, sort of language teaching. Chinese language, what's wrong with Chinese language teaching? What's wrong with Chinese teaching Chinese culture? What's wrong with the partnership and develop a partnership and friendship with schools in China? So we need to see what is behind all this. And secondly, I'd like to say that being critical of the Chinese Communist Party's ideas or their strategies is not anti-China. It's not anti-Chinese culture. It's not anti-Chinese people, which are often labeled by the Chinese Communist Party to anybody who holds different views to their own doctrines and to their own ideological framework. In fact, we truly love China. We love hardworking Chinese people. We love the Chinese 5,000 years of civilization and Chinese traditional culture and values, and that's why we're here. And I think when we look at these things, we need to go beyond what we can see on the surface, but really see through what is happening. So I don't want to spend probably too much time, but really I want to be clear, because from our discussion with people, and sometimes people have got this confusion. You see, the Chinese Communist Party always say, anti-China, anti-Chinese, anti-China. They cause this division. There's no division among our ordinary people. We all value the same things. We all value human rights. We value freedom of speech. We value the integrity, the academic integrity. The Chinese Communist Party, they try to confuse people. Make people think anything you criticize them, you're criticizing China, you're anti-China. So we've got to make this very clear. There's a sharp distinction between China and the Chinese communist regime. So, and also we're not even against Confucius Institutes. We're not against the teachers working in the Confucius Institutes. We're not even against the directors managing those institutes. What we try to expose is what is behind, what the Chinese communist regime tries to do behind this seemingly harmless Chinese language teaching program, which have been established by now in 525 universities around the world and 1,113 classrooms around the world. And their objective is to set up as many as 1,000 Confucius Institutes around the world by 2020. Why? Okay, let me just see if I can make this work here. And there have been a lot of concerns and criticism and debates among, starting, among academics, among scholars, among researchers, among people who have more probably sharp concept of what's happening. And they tend to ask why the Chinese Communist Party tried to set up all these programs. And some of the teachers working in the Confucius Institute say, hey, Yan, and hang on, we're not using any of the communist ideas in our classrooms, and our children are learning Chinese, and our children, whatever. But when you actually see what is actually presented in the provided textbooks, the contents of the textbooks, and you see, I can see, because I'm from China, I was brought up in China, I was brainwashed from the day I went to the kindergarten. The first song we sing is Long Live Chairman Mao, the East is Red. And we brought up with this, and I was so shocked to see that in today's time, in a Western democratic society, in our schools, our children are singing songs in praise of Mao Zedong, who is responsible for the killing or for the unnatural deaths of over 80 million Chinese people in peacetime. In peacetime. That's times of our Australian population. And the Chinese Communist Party, there's nothing Confucian in the Confucius Institute because the Chinese Communist Party is the one that has destroyed the traditional culture, has destroyed Confucius' ethical values and the ideological thoughts that have been embedded in Chinese culture for 1,000 years and laid down a solid foundation for how we conduct ourselves. But all this was destroyed by the Communist Party, and especially during the Cultural Revolution, and the so-called smash up the 4 O's, 4 thoughts, 4 culture, 4 old thoughts, old culture, old customs, and old habits. Confucius' ideas and ideologies just went completely destroyed. But now they're in the name. Why? Have a look. And for those people who are not familiar with the Confucius Institute, is who actually operates this. Let's have a look. Hanban, you often hear Hanban. Hanban is actually just a name we use. I refer to the Office of Chinese Language Council International, which is the headquarters of the Confucius Institute, and it works very closely with the Education Ministry. And also the head of Hanban, who is in charge, is a former Politburo member. The Politburo, probably here we have the House of Representatives, we have Senate, but in China they've got this political bureau or the standing committee, which has only a handful of people, 7 or 9, in charge of everything, rule 1.4 billion Chinese people. So ahead was one of the Politburo members. And also it works in conjunction with all these Chinese, high-level Chinese government organs like Ministry of Education, the General Office of the State Council, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Culture, and the State Council of the Information Office, which is really the propaganda office. And now I'd like you to probably see one of the quotes I put here. And this is by Li Changchun. He was one of the Politburo members, and he said in a speech at Confucius in Hanban in 2011, and he said, "The Confucius Institute is an appealing brand for expanding our culture abroad. It has made an important contribution towards improving our soft power. The Confucius brand has a natural attractiveness. Using the excuse of teaching Chinese language, everything looks reasonable and logical." Clearly, this is not what they tell Western universities or schools when they come to set up Confucius Institutes or classrooms. They say, "We're here to teach Chinese language, to help you, we give you money, we give you donation of textbooks." But this is what they say behind closed door, internally. So this is the agenda, hidden agenda. Okay, I probably leave this. This is another quote if you like to see. Again, by the Minister of Propaganda in China. He's also one of the Politburo members, and he said, "Coordinate efforts of overseas and domestic propaganda and further create a favorable international environment for us with regard to key issues that influence our sovereignty and safety. We should actively carry out international propaganda battles against issues such as Tibet, Xinjiang. The Uyghur people are being persecuted at the moment, and they spend millions and millions of money set up all these concentration camps to suppress the people. Taiwan, human rights, and Falun Gong. Maybe you have heard about Falun Gong. One or another, is a really peaceful cultivation, mind and body, based on the 3 principles: truthfulness, compassion, forbearance. And it's not a religion, but people might, in the Western society, will think it's a religion because it's a belief. But people really just go about their lives in everyday life, at work. If you're a professor, you're a politician, you're a soldier, student, housewife, or peasant, it doesn't matter. There are so many people. The only reason I was asked a question yesterday when I was at the Gold Coast, a screening in the name of Confucius, is that why does Chinese government try to persecute Falun Gong? Why Falun Gong practitioners are banned by the Confucius Institute? They're banned from teaching. They cannot teach in Confucius Institute if they're Falun Gong practitioners or if they involve in any activities Falun Gong practice. The Falun Gong is, as I said, is very peaceful practice, mind and body. And the reason is, after it started in 1999, the number of people practicing Falun Gong has increased from a couple of hundreds to over 80 million by Chinese official figure. And that is actually outnumber the Communist Party membership. And they think, there's so many people, and also among Falun Gong practitioners, there are a lot of Communist Party members, a lot of cadres, officials, lawyers, professors, students. So they're afraid that they might lose the control of Chinese people's mind. And that is one of the important things. One of the important strategies, how they can control 1.4 million Chinese people, is to control their mind. You can't think freely. You can't think independently. You have to think according to how the Communist Party wants you to think. You have to toe the line of the Chinese Communist Party. If you step out of the line, you're in trouble. Okay, the purpose of China's rise, especially from the beginning of 21st century. When China now is the second largest economic power in the world, and China has got a lot more say on international issues, and China's influences cannot be undermined, and China is our top trading partner. Okay, go quick. Partners in Australia. So, where was I? What I'm saying is, with this rise, a lot of people become concerned because China, not China. When I talk about China, I mean the Chinese communist regime. Please don't get me wrong, okay? Not the China proper. So sometimes I think probably I should write a thesis titled "In the Name of China," rather than in the name of Confucius, because what the Communist Party is doing has nothing to do with the real Chinese culture, the Chinese values. But anyway, this figure just shows you how the Chinese Communist Party is spending money around the world to reshape their image, to expand their influence, to have more say, more control on the world. But in China, millions of Chinese children in the rural areas could not even go to school due to poverty. And I'm just showing you some photos. These are the real photos depicting the real situations of some typical schools in rural China today, in 21st century, when Chinese Communist Party is spending millions, billions in developed countries, rich countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, when their own children are suffering like this. These are real pictures. They don't even have window. And they don't even have proper chairs and tables and textbooks. So this photo is just to show how the contrast. And also talking about the teacher requirements, I'm not going, and I already said this. And the contents, I mentioned it before, and this is a typical one. It's in the Chinese subject online, teaching people that the Korean War was started by the United States by bombing a few villages in northeast China. And that's why Chinese people have to stand up and support Korean people and defend their country. So it's totally distorted picture. But these textbooks, what we learned in primary school, now is online in Confucius classrooms for the Western people to study. Okay, so major concerns. I'm going to go quick. and things are happening. Some Confucius Institutes have been shut down. And some classrooms, like Professor Feng just mentioned in New South Wales, the classrooms are not going to be, for the time being, are not going to be continuing to be run. So this is really good news. I think it's actually working, what we're doing today. So questions. Is it acceptable to allow autocratic foreign government to run teaching programs in our universities and schools in Australia? Are we prepared to compromise our freedom of speech and academic integrity in exchange for money from undemocratic foreign regime? Should we subject the minds of young Australians to brainwashing contents by a foreign regime that holds totally different ideological, political, and moral values from ours? If we do, what will happen? Do the Australian government and the politicians have constitutional and moral obligations and responsibilities to stand up and defend the fundamental values we uphold as a democratic society we all cherish? Okay, I think we need to ask all these questions and we need to do something. What can we do? Learn the truth, learn the facts, and increase the public awareness of this important issue through various channels, including film screening. There's a film in the name of Confucius. Try to find it on Facebook and on the website. In the name of Confucius, very, very good award-winning documentary, and actually tells people what is happening. And the forums, mainstream, like what we have today, and the mainstream media. I hope the mainstream media help people understand what is happening, because that's also one of their responsibility for the society. And also form alliance with community and social groups that care about the importance of upholding Australian values and principles, and raise our concerns with the department concerns and various levels of governance, including federal and state MPs, and argue and urge them to take actions to stop CCP's aggressive infiltration into the education system in Australia. And we need to talk with institutions and schools that host Confucius Institute's classroom and help them understand why we need to say no to the CCP. Thank you.
Ms. Yin just laid down some solid background knowledge. Maybe save the time for the other speakers' basic background information, and then also raise a lot of very interesting questions. The others may follow to answer those questions. The next speaker will be Ms. Zheng Xue. She's from Canada. Is very well-known freelance writer, fabulous journalist who win a lot of awards, and she is also very passionately engaged in the debate about Confucius Institutes and Confucius classrooms in Canada. I hope she will provide the Canadian perspective for our debate. Now, welcome, Zheng Xue.
Good evening. Thank you, everyone who is here. That means that you are paying attention to this issue. And thank you, wonderful speakers, except me. And thank you for our chair, Professor Feng. We have been friends for many years. For the Confucius Institute issue, that we need to know what is that, what we are talking about. From the official expression of the Confucius Institute, that they said Confucius Institute is about education, culture, language, history, teaching, philosophy, understanding of China, and making friends in the world. So let we see. Is the Confucius Institute is about education? My answer is no. Why is not? Because there's more than 10 million of kids out of school. They don't have the right to receive education in China. So why the Chinese Communist Party spends millions, billions of dollars in very well-developed democratic countries to establish education? So there is a question mark. Why is that? And for today, the education in China is most likely a joke. If you search about the information online, you can find out a lot of information will surprise you. For example, the very latest news is high school student, in case of to pass examination to university, that you have to pass a political will first. So which is very oftenly taken in the years of 60s, 70s, and now, we are going back to there. And is the Confucius Institute is about culture? My answer is no. Why is not? Because what is the culture of CCP? You may don't know, but every Chinese knows. And I lived in China for 27 years. I'm being abroad for 29 years, so you know my age. And the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, destroyed almost all the traditional culture and established a hatred culture that with no respect to lives, no trust to people, no real belief to any religion, and no mercy to others, no sense of right or wrong, beautiful or ugly, no kindness over evil. So this is the main points of the CCP culture in China. So can we exchange this kind of culture to Australia, to Canada, or anywhere else? Is it about language? My answer is no. Where the Confucius Institute landed, all have large Chinese communities, and there are many, many Chinese language schools. I think it is the same here in Sydney, because there are many Chinese language schools in Toronto, where I come from. And this is not about language teaching. And what else? So people said, anyway, Confucius Institute is about Confucius' thoughts and philosophy. No, the answer is absolutely no, because the CCP destroyed all of Confucius' thoughts and philosophy. And where, the Confucius has been isolated and criticized for many, many years. And the Chinese Communist doesn't believe in that at all. And I will give an example later. So, understanding China? Probably. But let me see. The Chinese Communist Party controls China. And if we want to understand China through the Confucius Institute, that means that we are understanding China through the CCP system, right? So it's not it's not the good way. And making friends, probably right, but none of the above. So when it's not what it says, what it really is. What is that? I'm not going to make a guess. I'm going to give you the words from the head of the party, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, Hu Jintao. I will quote part of his speech. Then you will understand what Confucius Institute really is. He said, "It is also worth to mention that we are not only focusing on keeping the party's existing ruling status, but also more focusing on cultivating servers, sages, and on expanding our party's influence throughout China and the world, in particular around the core of our widely established Confucius Institutes. We have deployed a wide range of Chinese schools over the world to enhance the influence of our party and to search and cultivate our party's sympathizers and our active supporters among all countries and ethnics, who are all our human resources with great talents. It is neither because we suddenly start to appreciate Confucius, nor because we are going back to the Confucius and Mencius era. An army of sages is the most important soft power of our party. After many years of our hard work, we have already established a successful mood in training of our reserve sages. This is implemented through the network of party schools, administration colleges, universities, and Chinese schools abroad. In the future, when the China century emerges to the world, the influence of our party will widespread all over the world, and of course, we will need a range of management talents to serve our needs over the world. So, thanks to Hu Jintao. Otherwise, we need to do a lot of work to study, to do research. And he has been being very honest to told us what is the Confucius Institute about. So we don't need to argue about this. So why this is very dangerous to us? People may say, even though, why is it too dangerous to us? Okay, I give you an example. Let me see. The head of the Chinese Communist Party is said already that the Confucius Institute is the soft power of it. But what is the hard power of that? Millions of people have been sent to concentration camps in Xinjiang now, right now. Not just 30 years ago, 40 years ago, but is in our time. You Google it, you will find out. And second, millions of Falun Gong practitioners were taken their organs livelily. This has not happened 100 years ago or 50 years ago. It is happening now. And 153 Tibetans, they were self-immolated from 2011 to last week. It is happening now. And Dr. Wang Bingzhang was kidnapped in Vietnam 2002, and Dr. Peng Ming was kidnapped from Cambodia, 2004, and then Gui Minghai, Jiang Yefei, and Dong Guangping were kidnapped in Thailand, 2015. There are many, many other examples that I don't have time to give you the number, but it is the reality. So it is the CCP's hard power is running the other side. And so people may wonder, what is the CCP wants to do? The CCP is the communist. It is the communism. So to my understanding, my very recent study of that, I think communism together with fascism and terrorism, the three kinds of system are not part of our human history, but are three kinds of cancer to our human being's body. So they are destroying us. And of course, the fascism is some times ago, and it's not very active. But the terrorism is pretty active, but it's locally. And the communism, especially the Chinese communism, is the wonderful performance of three kinds mixed together. And what we are facing is they are trying to ship their ideals, their beliefs, and their hatred, everything to our land. And a lot of them have already been taken roots here. Do we want the examples, as I explained, to happen in our environment? I think the answer is no. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sheng Xue. Now let me call on Fei Professor John Fitzgerald from Melbourne. He used to be my boss. He served as president of the Academy of Humanities in Australia, and also my very respected historian. I'm also trained as a historian. Write very good books. His book published in a very long time ago, 1996 or something. The Awaken China won a very famous award from American Association of Asian Studies. And then, of course, he later work about the white Australia, the white line.
Big white line.
Big white line. Chinese Australians in the white Australia. That's right. So now, later on, he moved to work on politics. So he's both historian and political scientist. So let's welcome him to see whether he can offer or not.
Thank you, Chongyi, Professor Feng, and to the Australian Values Alliance team for organising this very important event and bringing together such a wonderful cohort of speakers and an audience of interested participants. I'm sure you have many questions, and I look forward to your raising them in the course of the evening. I prepared a formal talk because I don't want to go off script. Let me put it that way. This is a highly fractious topic, a very sensitive topic, and RITs fly fast, as we all know, in this field. So bear with me if, turn that away, it's a bit of a distraction. If I stick to the text here. In questions, we might be able to be a little more free form. Now, this university, the China Research Institute, ACRI, issued a report late last week entitled, "Do the Claims Stack Up?" You'll be aware of that. Do the claims of Chinese interference, that is to say Chinese Communist Party government interference and influence operations in Australia stack up? And the answer, as you might expect, is resounding, no, 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 nothing here. There's not a chapter, in fact, on Confucius Institutes. I mean, I commend that report to your judgment. Read it for yourselves and make what sense of it you will. There's nothing on Confucius Institutes of any substance, and so I thought I'd add that missing chapter here. Confucius Institutes, do the claims stack up? Now, we all know what Confucius Institutes claim to do, or are supposed to do, teach language and culture. And if that's all they did, let me say I would welcome them. I'm not too concerned that the Chinese government should be locked out in some way of higher education in Australia. I mean, if it's got something to offer, well and good. What in fact is it offering, though? That's the question, I think, in front of us. And of course they come in all shapes and sizes, Confucius Institutes. So Sydney universities, for example, may offer Chinese culture and language classes and be perfectly benign, as its director, Jin Sing, pointed out in a recent interview with Rob Bolton, the Australian Financial Review. And it's not easy to generalise because in some respects they're each unique, each has a particular mission. Some are dedicated to teaching in tourism, some into Chinese medicine, others straight language and literature. So as Jin Sing said in that interview with Rob Bolton, I can't speak for all other Confucius Institutes in Australia, it's only my experience, but let me tell you, all we do is language and culture. That may be the case. I don't wish to cast any doubts on those claims. Nevertheless, she moves on to say, hence any criticism of Confucius Institutes has to be based on misunderstanding and implying some kind of racial bias, not unlike ACRI. Now that's moving from a particular to the general pretty quickly, and I'd like to suggest if we do a survey of what Confucius Institutes are doing across Australia, we might draw a couple of different conclusions. In fact, other cases in Australia don't bear out the claims in that important article. And beyond the anecdotal evidence, at this university, at that university, there are clearly systemic and generic connections among the institutes and key players in China, particularly key agencies under the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, answerable to the Politburo at the end of the day. In fact, all of Australia's Confucius Institutes are integrated into China's larger strategic agenda, which has been discussed already. I won't dwell on it at length here. But broadly, this is described as telling good China stories, in Xi Jinping's words, 讲好中国故事. The idea is that China is going to promote people internationally, support them, to tell good stories about China and silence the bad ones. That's the missing sentence, but let me tell you that's actually how it works. And secondly, as a 2014 Australian Parliamentary Library paper pointed out, senior figures in the Politburo and the Ministry of Education have stated publicly that Confucius Institutes are part of a strategic plan for increasing our soft power. That's already been cited as well. In fact, in Australia, we do have clear instances of Confucius Institutes performing this larger strategic role, going way beyond language and culture. Take Xi Jinping's signature Belt and Road Initiative, for example. Now, we can argue all we like about the merits of the Belt and Road Initiative, and where I come from in Victoria, a lot of people are debating the merits one way or the other, because the Premier has signed an agreement with the NDRC, the National Development Reform Commission, committing the state to the Belt and Road Initiative. I don't want to get into that argument. I'd just like to ask, well, are Confucius Institutes in this space as well? Are they selling the Belt and Road Initiative? If they are, is this just language and culture, or is it serious geopolitics? That's the question I put out there. And let's now go hunting for the evidence. It doesn't take much. In fact, CIs, Confucius Institutes, forgive me if I say CIs occasionally, but that's how they're generally referred to in the trade, CIs around the world have been told explicitly by Beijing they must promote the Belt and Road Initiative, that it's core to their mission. At the National Hanban Confucius Institute conference in December 2016, Vice Minister for Education Hopping stated that on the public record that the Belt and Road Initiative is a, and I quote, top-level design and vital guidance for all of China's international education, cooperation and exchange programs, including, obviously, Confucius Institutes. So the Belt and Road Initiative is, and I quote, a top-level design and vital guideline around which Belt and Road activity should be organised. So let's jump onto the web pages of Australia's Confucius Institutes. Which of them have convened Belt and Road events over the past year or two? It doesn't take much to find out. A quick search of those websites shows that Confucius Institutes at the University of Adelaide, at Charles Darwin University in Darwin, and at RMIT have each held significant public events promoting the Belt and Road Initiative. In addition, the Confucius Institute at the University of New South Wales promotes Australian engagement in the Belt and Road Initiative on its website with quotes from an extended speech by one of its own university administrators that reads, and I quote, Australian higher education institutes must chart a course to Asia as China's ambitious One Belt, One Road, that's the old name for it, Belt and Road, foreign policy initiative offers a pathway to the future. And that's on the Confucius Institute website. So then, do claims that Confucius Institutes more than just language and culture centres stack up? Check the web pages and the annual reports that the university CIs and judge for yourself. You'll find that they are engaged in promoting Beijing's global and regional geopolitical strategies. They've been told to. Of course they will. Then what about the claim, secondly, that Confucius Institutes uphold principles of academic freedom, or at least don't infringe them? Now it's my turn to be anecdotal, to bring out a single data point through a personal story. The University of Queensland hosted a China Film Festival in 4th of October this year, on the 4th of October, in the Schnell Theatre at the University of Queensland. And it was a terrific festival. And what's not to like about that? The Confucius Institute staged a film festival. Where did they get the idea? Well, I happened to be up there the year before, visiting the University of Queensland to present a public lecture on the challenges to academic freedom that China presents in universities today, a subject on which I've spoken widely in Australian universities and gave an annual lecture as president of the Academy, which is now published on the Academy's website. I also published on this in Australia's mainstream press. So I was invited to the University of Queensland to give this talk and coincidentally to participate in a Taiwan documentary film festival to be held on campus. When I arrived on campus at St. Lucia, I was taken aback to find the academic organisers of the Taiwan Documentary Film Festival were concerned the event may not be allowed to go ahead. Why, I asked. To this day, I'm not sure. I just know that they were concerned it might be cancelled. I'm not privy to the full background of this incident, but I understand that formal academic approval had been granted for the film festival through the normal channels. Also, that a number of historical documentaries were to be screened as useful teaching resources. That is, they had academic merit as well as being half-decent films. In fact, I saw them and they were outstanding films. So, supplementing an academic subject on offer in the history program. And yet, the people convening it told me they were afraid it may not be able to proceed. I'd like clarity from the university about whether the Confucius Institute director was in any way involved in generating this concern. If so, what did he say to the faculty about the event? What did he say to the history program director? What did he say to any academic or administrative staff at any level of that university about that event? How did they react? And what did they do in response to his comments? Why, in short, were my academics colleagues fearful it wouldn't be able to proceed? Now, I ask this because the preservation of academic freedom requires constant vigilance. On this point, I have a few further questions related to governance and vigilance at the University of Queensland, and allow me to set these out in some detail. First, If the CI director did insert himself into this matter, on what authority did he do so in an academic program, history, that really has nothing to do with Chinese language and culture? It wasn't in the Chinese language program or culture program. Second, if a historical documentary festival of Taiwan film festivals does fall within the Confucius Institute's director's responsibility, then I would ask the University of Queensland, how is it that a Confucius Institute director who reports one way or the other to the Chinese consulate is permitted to hold a responsible position on a faculty leadership team that enables him to make decisions bearing on all matters academic in the faculty about everything under the sun, including, presumably, not only questions such as whether historical films about Taiwan may be screened on campus, but also sitting in judgment on whether I, as President of the Academy of Humanities, should be allowed to talk on academic freedom in China. Who approved who was sitting on the executive committee that approved my coming to the University of Queensland and giving a talk on academic freedom in China? I'm not suggesting there was any intervention, there was none. But I'd be extraordinarily surprised if that kind of approval was to be given by somebody who reports to the consulate. My third question is this: what level of due diligence does Vice-Chancellor Peter Hoy, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Queensland, apply to academic linkages with China? I ask because the Vice-Chancellor, in addition to being an outstanding researcher and leader in his own right, is also an outstanding figure in the World Confucius Institute network. At the time in question, when I was there, he sat on the International Council of the Confucius Institute headquarters in Beijing, one of just 16 senior international consultants to the Hanban headquarters, where he represents all Confucius Institutes, not only in Australia, but New Zealand and the Pacific Islands. I understand, that's what Oceania means. In these roles, his outstanding contribution to China's global Confucius Institute network was acknowledged in 2015 at the Confucius Institute's Global Conference in Shanghai, when he was awarded the Outstanding Individual of the Year Award by Chinese Vice Premier Madam Liu Yandong for promoting Confucius Institutes in the Oceania region, marking him the most outstanding contributor internationally to Hanban's global mission that year. Well and good. But the UQ's own website promotes this award along with a congratulatory message from the Hanban Chief Executive, Madam Xu Lin. Now, keen observers will recall that in 2014, the year before this award was made to the University of Queensland's Vice-Chancellor, this very Madam Xu Lin was at the centre of an international controversy over academic freedom in Europe. In July 2014, she personally intervened at a major European academic conference in Portugal to remove pages about Taiwan that she found objectionable from a European academic program on China. This was no small incident. Madam Xu Lin, as director of the Global CI Network, attended the conference in Portugal as a distinguished guest of a European academic conference. She rewarded that invitation by instructing her staff to rip out 4 pages from each of 300 conference booklets prepared by her host in the European Academy at the annual meeting of the largest and most prestigious European conference on China, the biennial conference of the European Association of Chinese Studies. Scholars attending that conference, as you'll imagine, were pretty outraged. This is not news, by the way, it's all in the press. It's not new. I'm just reminding people that this is the person that congratulated the University of Queensland and whose congratulatory letter is referenced on the University of Queensland Confucius Institute website. The association in Europe issued a letter of protest which said, and I quote in part, "This is the first occasion in the history of the European Association that its conference materials have been censored." It concluded, "Such interference in the internal organisation of the International Conference of an independent and democratically organised, non-profitable academic organisation is totally unacceptable." In fact, it's not unacceptable in China, it's normal. This is the culture that Confucius Institutes are promoting internationally. They do promote culture. It's the culture of an authoritarian regime which seeks to control the narrative of itself. But this kind of language and culture that CIs are promoting is not welcome in Europe. Why is it welcome in Australia? Why would Madame Xulin, whose actions at that time were totally reprehensible, be applauded, be listed on the University of Queensland website as applauding the work of the University of Queensland's Vice-Chancellor? No alarm bells went off in the UQ Executive Building when the VC was honoured with the Global CI Award, or when Madame Xulin sent her a letter of congratulation despite her role in that incident. No responsible person in the Chinese language and culture program came forward to alert the university not just to the educational or academic but reputational risks of accepting this award of association with Madame Xulin. And that earlier controversy does not appear to have alerted UQ to the risks of Hanban intervention in academic affairs relating to Taiwan on its own campus. That's why I asked, what happened that caused serious concern to the conveners of a Taiwan documentary film festival at UQ last October? Perhaps the recently established inquiry into academic freedom on Australian campuses, led by former High Court Chief Justice Robert French, can put these questions to the executive leadership team at the University of Queensland. And in fairness, we should await the answers before we decide whether the claims of Confucius Institute interference at this level in the academic affairs of university really do stack up. I don't wish to prejudge that. I'm just flagging a serious issue here, which I think requires closer investigation. Let me conclude then with a couple of remarks. When criticism of Confucius Institutes have been aired in Australia, they've been brushed aside by Vice-Chancellors with the claim they play no part in university decision-making, have little impact on what's taught, said and done on campus, in fact do almost nothing at all. So from our university's defensive comments, they appear so inconsequential, the wonder is that any university bothers to host one at all. In fact, they are highly consequential. First, they're not just centres for teaching and learning about Chinese language and culture. Their roles are embedded in Beijing's strategic planning for extending geopolitical influence through, as I've noted, promoting, for example, the BRI through the Australian University Network. Second, they curate all information that they offer about the history, culture and politics of China to accord with the national interests of China. Their curriculum and teaching materials are censored at the margins to pass the test of party-approved scholarship, and their directors are expected to play a role in preventing the circulation of materials in class, and I'd suggest out of class, that party authorities wouldn't allow in China. Third, Confucius Institutes offer avenues for academic staff promotion, allowing them to move into positions of influence in Australian universities, which I consider inappropriate for individuals who represent organisations that are partly managed by the Chinese government. Institute directors can be found sitting on faculty executive committees that oversee all academic matters relating to the humanities, which I take very, very seriously, and the social sciences, not just language and culture. They're in a position to advise university staff dealing with international students and community engagement relating to China and Chinese Australian communities as well. Some directors are involved in university decision-making on matters that China regards as highly sensitive, way outside the remit of a CI, such as in relation to events relating to Taiwan on campus. Fourth, the creation of Confucius Institutes signalled to authorities in China that Australian universities are prepared to make an exception for Beijing on questions of academic freedom, the integrity of the institution, and teaching curricula. They signal that the due diligence Australian universities routinely apply to their own teaching and research and to any other international relationship are set aside in dealing with China. This opens the door to extensive research collaboration in the STEM disciplines, which in many cases, I would argue, is the point of the exercise. It's not just about humanities and social sciences by any means. This STEM, that is science, technology, engineering and maths, this STEM research collaboration is the subject of Alec Joski's very important recent report for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, or ASPI, on STEM collaboration with military and defence establishments in China. In signalling to China that they will set aside normal academic standards, Australian Confucius Institutes are part of that larger and in some ways far more important story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fei Fuchsius, Professor John Fitzgerald, very senior academic, offering profound thinking about the Confucius Institute, its operation in Australia. Now, I call on my close friend, Captain Carrico, Confucius, yes, from academic from Macquarie University. He has been working on racism, race, or Chinese nationalism, and published a very good book on that last 2 years. I mean, you will be a good expert to talk about the Confucius Institute, the Chinese racism or that, or anti-Chinese racism. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Now, I don't know, if you had told me maybe 5 or 6 years ago that I'd be, talking at a public roundtable about Confucius Institutes, I probably would have felt a little surprised because, to be honest, when the controversy about Confucius Institutes really started picking up in the United States, really about 5 years ago, I sort of felt a little, ambivalent, and viewed Confucius Institutes as perhaps somewhat lower risk than some of the other, very disconcerting matters that we deal with in sort of PRC party state global influence. Issues like, indirect or even direct PRC control of Chinese language media, issues with, students reporting other students' comments back to China to apply pressure to their families and them, or, the PRC government detaining or otherwise pressuring the families of outspoken individuals who live abroad as ways to silence them. I also have worked at 2 universities with Confucius Institutes, Stanford and Oklahoma. And, while I was there, I just did what I usually do. And, of course, Confucius Institute staff didn't come to my talks. That didn't surprise me. Some of the topics may not have exactly been in their area of interest, or rather areas that they want to talk about. So I took a sort of ambivalent view of Confucius Institutes as a whole. Now, this, of course, contrasts, I suppose, with, political leaders in the PRC statements about Confucius Institutes, where, these are clearly viewed as important parts of an overseas propaganda push, part of an overseas sort of campaign for soft power to tell China's story well. And I've come to realize that concern about Confucius Institutes is not actually separate from, but very much intertwined with these kinds of larger issues that have been of great concern to me. So, of course, there are a few events that stand out over the past, 5 or 6 years. The Sonia Zhao case in McMaster University, where someone who was a enthusiast of Falun Gong was, essentially discriminated against based upon her own beliefs and pressured as a result by her Confucius Institute, which led to the McMaster Confucius Institute being closed down. Professor Fitzgerald, of course, just mentioned Xu Lin's her very interesting intervention in language and culture, right, by tearing out certain language from a European conference program, and thereby changing, one might say, the culture of academic freedom, or attempting to change it there. So I think, in retrospect, really, the fundamental issue that one sees in Confucius Institutes, which relates to my broader concerns, is their role as instruments of exercising leverage, right, over universities that should be very much independent from having decisions made by a completely unaccountable and increasingly authoritarian political system. And it's also about very much normalizing that leverage, not just allowing it, but also making it seem like something that just happens, right? Confucius Institutes, I suppose everybody knows, they have secret contracts, and the clauses of these contracts can't be revealed. Well, one might find that a bit disconcerting, right? The individual treaties with universities. In turn, I think this type of normalization of these secret agreements also helps to create an environment in which, a state of Australia, can also sign a secret agreement with China on the topic of the Belt Road Initiative, and somehow believe that this is something that can just be, kept quiet and secret from the people so that they don't have to get involved in these complex matters. Okay. Another issue of normalization, right, is that, a standard understanding of all Confucius Institutes is that they're supposed to abide, right, by the laws and regulations of China. One perhaps can't talk about Falun Gong, one can't, speak too honestly about Taiwan. Now, this is an interesting development because, of course, the Chinese Communist Party itself doesn't have an exactly outstanding tradition of abiding by its own laws and regulations. If one reads the PRC Constitution, there's a bit of a discrepancy between rhetoric and reality. So, by hosting a Confucius Institute, a university is essentially, inviting the CCP and its closure and its lawlessness into one school, or if you're in the New South Wales Department of Education, inviting that, into your government department, okay, and allowing this, political institution that doesn't abide by any of its own laws or regulations to oversee the selection of teachers, the selection of teaching materials, managing how people learn Chinese language and learn to talk about China, okay? And this, I should emphasize, is the same Chinese Communist Party that has crushed an emerging civil society, arrested essentially all human rights lawyers who would have provided a path for a normal, fairly peaceful transition to a more open society. The same CCP that's abandoned already limited checks on power by essentially allowing Xi Jinping to be basically emperor for life. Revitalized a cult of personality that, essentially set China back decades in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Kidnapped booksellers and other international critics of the PRC party state. And I should emphasize, is now overseeing, a network of concentration camps in Xinjiang, holding, over 1 million people indefinitely and arbitrarily, solely on the basis of their ethnicity, and then in turn suggesting this as a potential solution for countries around the globe to properly handle the threat of terrorism. Okay? So this is who one is partnering with when one partners with a Confucius Institute, and I find that deeply problematic. I myself, have spent, nearly a quarter, well, I'm getting older now almost a fifth of my life, living in China. And one of the lessons that I took away from that experience was, a deep love for the country and a deep concern, right, about the political environment there. And so there's a reason I don't live there now. And I do think, just to close off on a personal note, after making that personal decision, I do think it is a bit inconvenient, a bit disturbing, right, that in choosing a school for my own child, I now have to look into whether that school hosts Confucius classroom or not. So the sort of spread of this very problematic authoritarian and disconcerting political culture into sort of global educational institutions and broader global culture is an issue that I think should concern us all, and is something that we need to think about very carefully. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Captain Carrico. He's originally from United States, also taught at several universities at the U.S. as well. We may take his talk as an American perspective. Okay. Good. Our next speaker will be Confucius. That's Mr. John Garnaut. He had a very high-profile career. Originally worked with the Fairfax Media as correspondent as well as editor, and later on served as principal advisor to the Prime Minister, to the Cabinet, to the defense. So very, very high profile. But he's also a very serious scholar. I enjoy his book on Chinese high politics. His book on the what's the title? Is the rise and fall of the House of Bo Xilai. And I'm told that he's now working on the sequel to it. That's Xi Jinping and the cohort of the Red Peninsulans. I'm looking forward to it. So let's welcome Mr. John Garnaut.
Thank you, Professor Feng. Before I start, I want to pay some serious tribute to the moral courage of several people, a lot of people in this room, including Marie Ma in front of me, including Professor Feng Chongyi. You talk about my high profile. Well, if you wouldn't keep getting kidnapped, it wouldn't be so high. And several others, John Hugh also. It's not a difficult. It's not always straightforward to stand on your convictions on these issues, and even more so if you're part of an ethnic Chinese community in Australia or around the world. And if I know anything, most of what I know comes from the ethnic Chinese community in Australia, and I deeply appreciate it, and I admire you. I'm going to be quick for a number of reasons. One, Professor Feng wants to get to Q&A. Two, my children have got me to swear that I wouldn't mention whether or not they went to Confucius Institutes and what they might find at their Confucius Institute classrooms. And three, my wife has, I've promised her that I wouldn't get sued today as well. But I want to just sort of reframe, without adding to all the fabulous contributions already, just reframe it a little bit. And just, I think it's enough now. There's now enough information out there. There's now enough coverage, thank you, to assume that there is risk. That if you're a university administrator, you have to assume that some of this might be true. And if it might be true, what are you doing to manage this risk? This is a question that national leaders are grappling with, have been grappling with. I think they've actually done quite a remarkable job in a short amount of time to start building risk management structures. And this is a question that corporations address every single day of the week. You know, they're managing opportunity and risk, and they're mitigating risk. So in Australia, in Australian universities, there must be a reasonable possibility that some of this is true. If that is a fair statement, then clearly the better run universities are doing something to manage risk, and that's what they are doing. One of the really optimistic, hopeful, I'm on the optimistic side of this conversation, in that I think people are responding to new information as the landscape changes, as they learn more. They're changing their behaviour. Not all of them, but I think we're probably seeing a bit of a bifurcation of institutions. Those who are serious about their management responsibilities, those who are serious about their fiduciary responsibilities to staff and to students, and those who are serious about the principles which they purport to uphold, including the principles of open academic inquiry and freedom, and those who still are stuck in a little bit of a shall we say, a willful blindness state of being. Now, in order to change behaviour, it's one thing to understand the argument, it's another thing to have your incentives changed. And I think it's really important to note how dramatically the incentives are being changed right now around the world, but also, and maybe particularly in Australia. And if I look at just some of the government initiatives over the last little while, some of them have been mentioned already. There's a review of the New South Wales embedded Confucius Institute situation where they're having a review of our classrooms, and also a review of whether Confucius Institutes should be allowed inside the New South Wales state government. I think Professor Feng might have already foreshadowed the outcome of that review. That's news to me. Just a week or two ago, the Education Minister talked about linking Australian Research Council grants to national security assurance, where you actually have to proactively show how does this bit of work contribute to national well-being, and show how it doesn't compromise national security objectives. This is new. This is a lot of money. Most administrators respond to money. We're talking about $3 billion here of ARC grants. There's other things that are going on as well. The laws that were passed in a bipartisan fashion, thanks in part to, I think, some really important advocacy and behind-the-scenes work on both sides of politics. I'm pleased to see some morally courageous MPs in the audience tonight. The criminal interference laws that were introduced, they do introduce a new crime of interfering with somebody's political rights. And so if you're interfering with, in somehow prescribing the political rights, the voting rights, or even the rights of political communication of an Australian resident or citizen, you may now be liable for a criminal offence. This is new. This dramatically changes the ecosystem of incentives for the way people will act and behave on campuses and elsewhere in this country. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, is the new Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme. Now, this is up and running. It was enacted. It's going to be implemented sooner rather than later. I think it has to be implemented by the middle of next year. I would imagine the politicians would want to get on with the job over the next couple of months. When they do, the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme will effectively require any entity that is a foreign-related entity and an individual who acts in a political fashion, engages in political activities on behalf of that foreign entity, they will need to register under the transparency scheme. Now, that doesn't need to be a taint. It's certainly not a criminal taint, But if you don't do it, if you're not forthcoming about those links and the nature of your activities, well, you risk a 7-year jail term. Again, that dramatically changes the incentives for university administrators in particular. And in the spirit of asking questions rather than issuing sort of defamatory allegations, it would be a really interesting question to ask, whether Confucius Institutes, which we're talking about today, which of them, how are they structured, and which of them are structured in such a fashion that in fact effective control or substantial control is exercised by a foreign state. If they are, it's likely that some Confucius Institutes, depending on how they're structured, may be a foreign-related entity for the purposes of the transparency scheme. And then if there are individuals who are attached to that institute acting on its behalf and engage in the sort of activities which John and others have been talking about today, they need to register under the scheme. So I'm not trying to give a legal lesson, I'm just trying to make the point that in this new era of awareness, where the era of blindness or willful blindness is gone, everybody's now on notice that there is information out there to alert you to the fact that there are risks, and now there are legal structures in place in order to change the behaviour of people who are inclined to be willfully blind. So I think that's probably going to be a game changer. It all depends on implementation. It all depends on communication, including at a elite political level. And I actually think this is a great opportunity for universities and also Confucius Institutes just to be more transparent about how they act and how they're structured, and if necessary to show their own administrators how they behave and how they conform with the law, and if they're engaging in political activity, to be transparent about that fact. Because in the end, I think what we're really on about is just shoring up some of the vulnerabilities of our open, liberal, democratic system and working with and re-establishing them as strengths. You know, how do you work with the strengths of our open, liberal, democratic system in order to build resilience? That's all I've got to say for my prepared remarks. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
So no one is surprised why you are appointed as a principal or vice. Okay. I believe that there are some politicians here as well. I hope you can return to that position again. To provide some guidance on the development of Australia in its relationship with the Communist China. Okay. Now the floor is open for questions and comments.
Can I ask the last speaker, what was the name of was it the foreign transparency provision? Is that the word?
The foreign influence.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. It's really interesting. I was just curious, John, the transparency scheme. How is that enforced? Is it the AFP that would have to investigate the nature of a foreign agent for registering?
Let me come over here.
Okay. So at first instance, it's going to be administered by the Attorney General's Department, and presumably they've got a group set up to actively administer this. Presumably there'll be a website of some kind, and I hope there's going to be a pretty substantial outreach program. But of course, criminal enforcement is left to the police and the federal police, and also to the prosecutors, the DPPs. Thank you.
I might continue that question a little bit more detail. Transparency. So you can see the whole those things. There's money behind, and everybody talk about billions of dollars spent. Those money went to, particularly in Australia. So can the transparency will mention each institution be listed out on the website? How much fund would be in, or those details will be inside on the transparency.
So for institutes that are registered under this scheme, if they do register, I think they're still working on the regulations to determine exactly what should be disclosed. So that's that's a question that's still being examined, I think. But as a general principle, regardless of this legislation, you would think that university administrators who are interested in oversight, active oversight, would want to be starting to introduce more transparency into all of their arrangements, all of their outside funded joint research collaborations, and ensuring that there are some consistent standards of disclosure.
Thank you. Dominic Ma. Kevin mentioned a few times the word leverage, and I think this is fairly central to what's the issue going on here, is that the CCP seems to be following a foreign policy based on accumulating as much leverage as it can, and then using this in ways to coerce or manipulate other countries to get what it wants. Leverage in itself, I don't think is problematic. My mum has leverage over me, and that's fine, as it should be. And the US and the UK have leverage over us, but they haven't shown any history of trying to use that in a way that I think harms our interests. So the question becomes: is a state collecting a lot of leverage and acting in a way that, or has it demonstrated a behaviour that is potentially threatening to us? And then that links into the Confucius Institutes, because is this just one string in a bow of leverage? And what responsibility then do universities have to reduce their exposure to this kind of manipulation? Right? So are the universities exposed to manipulation through the Confucius Institutes? If they are, what can we do to encourage them to reduce their exposure? And if they're not, great.
I agree that there are, certainly in this world, different types of leverage, right? And, some can be relatively benign, others can be, I think, more problematic. And when we're talking about sort of Chinese party state leverage over universities, I think that sort of begins to drift into the problematic realm, right? We're not talking about, leverage to make sure that, everybody has academic freedom and things go well. That probably isn't the type of leverage that I think the sort of party state involved in developing the Confucius Institutes is envisioning, right? So in that sense, that particular type of leverage, I would imagine, coming from a system that doesn't exactly treasure academic freedom, would be, a source of concern. Of course, more broadly, issues of PRC leverage over Australia, I think, are also issues for concern in an era, of course, where, we're seeing growing tensions in the South China Sea, growing threats against Taiwan. But those are, I think, larger issues that probably deserve their own roundtable discussion, or probably multiple roundtable discussions, so I won't necessarily open up onto that. So.
Yeah, I'm fairly confident that this issue of leverage can be managed. The question really is, what does it take to ensure institutional integrity of the institution that's in a sense dependent on the Chinese market? Where does it draw the red line when it comes to acceding to demands from China in relation to the institution or its activities? And not just where does it draw the red line, where does China draw the sort of green line? That is to say, if you don't do this, you can't proceed. And I think a number of institutions are negotiating their red line and trying to figure out China's green line at the present time. Just to give an example, the ABC, you might recall, set up an organisation in Shanghai called Australia Plus.cn and closed down its Chinese language news and current affairs within Australia and relocated its broadcast of Chinese language news into Shanghai. And This meant, in effect, doing away with the Chinese language news service. More than that, it meant compromising the editorial standards with the ABC more broadly. One particular Chinese language a number of Chinese language translations of the Prime Minister's speeches in China, or rather of activities around his itinerary, was censored in the Chinese version and reported in the ABC in English quite differently. Now, when that was brought to public attention, the ABC rapidly, reorganised the deck chairs, has basically closed down Australia Plus CN, and has reinstated its Chinese language news and current affairs. Partly in consequence of which, China is now no longer allows ABC broadcasting into China. That was more recently. So there's a step sequence here of an institution, the ABC, being caught out, really through media attention that it didn't want, didn't anticipate, having to change its practices and reinstate the earlier system, then discovering China's green line was a bit further along. So it established a red line, China's green line was some further away, and so it's led to really a breakdown of the relationship, effectively, in my judgment. That said, the ABC is an Australian organisation. Its Chinese language content is for Australians and for other international citizens who speak and read Chinese. And they're more than happy with the current environment. So I guess that's an instance of a case where leverage was exercised, in return for which the ABC did away with something, transparency exposed that, the institution, mindful of its values and its integrity and the editorial values associated with reputation, has taken a decision whereby it's lost a revenue stream. The other thing is the ABC can only earn off-budget income overseas. Its overseas operations can generate income through advertising, but within the country they can't. So it lost that source of revenue. But tough.
Just wondering is whether the issue here concern is that the Confucius Institute may be the thin end of the wedge of Chinese filtration into our education systems. And I was just thinking of their issues of Chinese students in academic research, probably in the STEM areas, and with the issue of the intellectual property going back to China and being lost to the countries that were the host to the students, being an example.
So there is some concern around these issues, not just in Australia but internationally, but I don't think we should tar Chinese students with the brush of being spies. That's wholly inappropriate, it seems to me. There are particular programs which are conducted fairly naively in collaboration with some institutions in China, which are effectively weapons defence establishments or linked to the military. They've only just been recently come to light through Alex Josky's report. As I said, Confucius Institutes are important in building trust between institutions. That is their function. I mean, we might say there's no Confucianism in there. Actually, the ritual function of Confucius Institute is very Confucian. It's basically saying, we don't trust anybody in the world. We'll build a relationship of trust based on some mutual exchange, as in a sort of gift. There's an agreement that's secret, that builds the trust, and on that trust, everything else flows. China's not capable of entering into relationships in a normal, routine, institutional way, because there is no institutional trust in China. Nobody trusts anything in China unless it's through a network or someone they know. And that's the way China operates internationally. I don't want to get all anthropological around this, but the role of Confucius Institutes is to build that initial trust. Because in China you can't trust the law, and China wouldn't want to rely on Australian law because it couldn't get its way. So these sort of deals are done which create an environment within which a whole lot of other things are made possible. That is, I think, why the Confucius Institute flows over into the STEM area in very important ways, in ways that have implications that are not widely recognised.
Actually, I have two questions. The first one is, I think Dr. Ian mentioned mentioned about the New South Wales Department of Education. The Confucius Institute suppose has been suspended, but I checked the website today. The name of Shi Shuangyuan, manager of Confucius Institute, is still there, and also I didn't see so many other Confucius Institute and Confucius 67 Confucius classrooms still running. And when can we see the clear the government attitude, especially in New South Wales? Because I used to be a Chinese consul for in Sydney, and I know very well the Mr. Zhang, the manager of CIA. He used to be head of international education of Nanjing Normal University that is run by the Chinese government. So he was a former Chinese official, and then he was sent by our Ministry of Education as a language expert to assist, to work paid by the Chinese government to work for the Ministry of New South Wales, Ministry of Education. And then now you can see that he is an Australian citizen, and he is an Australian official. If you check the website, the report, he's been speaking on behalf of New South Wales government. So he's now an Australian official, government official. So Confucius Institute is a government institute under the Ministry of Education, and now they've been embedded in New South Wales state government, and that especially I'm worried about the 67 classrooms, Confucius classroom, really harmful for these children. And the second question will go to the Mr. John Garnaut about the transparency scheme law. That when can the first case be established? Because it seems that the law became effective in June, so allow 1 year for registration. So I haven't seen any Chinese United Front Work organization register. And it seems, when can the law be enforced?
Thank you, John. So the transparency scheme is not operational yet. It has to be operational before the middle of next year. My guess is that will happen sooner rather than later. Probably there will be a short grace period to allow people to get their affairs in order, but this will be alive and running before I think people are ready. On your question about the New South Wales Confucius Institutes, this is probably a globally unique arrangement of embedding a Confucius Institute inside a foreign government, and this review is actively underway. And Professor Feng, if I heard you right, he's broken the news that they've foreshadowed an announcement which will involve. I'll let Professor Feng speak for himself, but it looks like this is coming to a close, and I imagine some of those arrangements will be undone.
Yes, I did have a conversation with the Minister of Education in New South Wales. That's Rob Stokes. He told me that indefinitely suspended. And I also did invite Zhang Yuan to this function. And he actually told me that nothing can be done, everything is lie down in that. Although his name is still there, but it's currently suspended, not formally or not openly announced yet, but that's the current situation. It's a question there.
Thank you. I'm Tim Dodd from the Australian newspaper. And Professor Fitzgerald, you mentioned that, in your view, after the mysterious cancellation of the film festival at the University of Queensland, that might be a matter which Justice French could examine in his inquiry into freedom of speech and freedom of intellectual inquiry in universities. But I'd like to ask you more broadly, ought the matter of Confucius Institutes be part of that inquiry? And should he be looking into what impact there might be on the freedom of intellectual inquiry in universities which stem from the existence of these institutes?
Thank you. In fact, the Taiwan Film Festival was not cancelled. No, when I arrived, it was the staff were fearful that something was happening and that things were being said which I don't fully understand, which indicated to me it may not go ahead, but it did. And my understanding is that at that university, the lower level academic staff, as at all universities, boldly uphold principles and values of free and open critical inquiry and would never cancel such an event. Frankly, I don't know the full details, and I invite further inquiry. As for the inquiry that's just been announced, it's not clear to me whether it's inquiry into process or inquiry into historical fact, so to speak. Setting out a case or looking at the way in which universities manage these issues. My suspicion is it's a management inquiry. And if it's not the case that it's appropriate for this inquiry to explore what happened at that particular incident, then I think it should be explored. Then the university itself ought to explain what happened. Why was it that low-level staff felt extremely anxious on that occasion about its possible cancellation? More broadly, universities are supposed to be self-managing. They don't welcome inquiries of this kind. I think if they want to forestall further intervention in university management, as they should. I mean, I've been in university and there's quite enough outside external, benchmarking and reporting. They don't need any more. But if they want to do that, they need, as John said, to take this risk management seriously. And universities which openly demonstrate through their transparency and their risk management strategies that they are doing so seriously need not fear any kind of external inquiry or intervention. It's not the business of government, in my judgment, to be telling universities what to do. They're self-governing. But universities need to responsibly exercise that self-governing function.
But what is the matter? What the matter of Confucius Institutes and the possibility of the inhibitions on the freedom of intellectual inquiry be one of the subjects which Justice French looks into in this review?
I think that would be extremely helpful. And even if it were just a review of process, then the processes around which these contracts have been entered into, the terms under which the institutes operate, would clearly fall within such an inquiry, even if it's not into historical abuse, so to speak. So, yes, I think that's a very good idea.
Thank you very much for this number of speakers. I have been following most of you on this issue for quite a while. As I'm aware, actually the CCP's influence or infiltration worldwide is quite widespread. Clive Hamilton published a big book, and recently he's talking about Red Buddhism, and in Tasmania, down under over there. Also in Australia, there are many councils or cities having a sort of cities relationship with some cities in China one way or another. Many politicians one way or another have been receiving donations from Chinese sources one way or another. My two questions probably to the two Johns is, what needs to be done to expose the full extent of China or CCP's intent to influence countries like Australia and the world? And the second question related is, what needs to be done to educate the public, particularly the officials, so the city mayors or the politicians, so they are more aware, more readily educated to stop it?
This is a very big question. If I could just revert to ancient Greek metaphor for a moment. There's this story that Hercules is told to go and clean the Augean stables. These are a set of stables that for 30 years have had 30,000 cattle in them, and nobody's ever cleaned the stables. And he comes in and says, "Oh my God, there's an awful lot of stuff on the floor here." and it's going to take me another 30 years to clean it up. My impression is, if just to apply that to the current situation, my concerns here are really about 3 or 4 major, very public signs of institutions in this country compromising their principles and possibly compromising the national interest in their relations with China. I wouldn't personally propose cleaning out the whole stables. You know, if there's continued engagement at various levels and state to state and city to city, fine. The risk is we'll end up having to undermine all 30 or 40 years of people-to-people ties unless this is sorted. And I wouldn't like to see that. Australia's invested a lot, and China's invested a lot in good faith and in trust, in building good people-to-people ties. This has been destroyed not by Australia, but by Xi Jinping's very aggressive actions in the South China Sea and by his return to Maoism within China. That's why we suddenly look around at the stables and say, whoa, there's a lot of dirty cattle in here. Somebody, Hercules, come in and clean this up. Now, at this point, I don't think we're quite there. You know, if we can just clean out a couple of stalls, you know, we might be able to move on and Xi Jinping might move on and we can revert to building good relationships between our countries. But I think at the present time, we're at a point where we don't quite know how deep this goes, nor do we know how deep the cleaning should proceed, whether we have to flood it as Hercules. What he did, he didn't get a hose. He redirected 2 rivers, you know, like the great Yao and Shun of China, you know, bring in the rivers, clean the Augean stables. I don't think we should do that. I think we're still dealing with this with a hose, perhaps a fire hose, and we should just focus on those critically important issues and institutions that might place sovereignty and integrity at risk and leave the people-to-people relationships alone as far as possible, because there are many people in Australia that feel great goodwill towards China. I'm one of them. Likewise in China towards Australia, and we wouldn't want to sever those deep and abiding ties.
The gentleman already covered, Lai Ha Chen from UTS. The gentleman already covered my question, and thank you, Professor Fitzgerald, for your answer. I actually want to, this question I want to address to another John, so I would like to hear your answer for this question. So what should Australia do, or should we still engage partly with China, or should we, you know, you mentioned about this legal structure to prevent interference, and how would that kind of the legal structure from Australia will affect the China's relation, or how China will react to this kind of the legal structure that we are setting up right now?
Thank you for the question. I think the objective at the university level is the same as it is at the national level. It's not how to end or break the relationship, but actually quite the opposite, how to make it healthy and sustainable and ensure you can continue to reap the opportunities and the good things that come with it while managing risk. I think that's the whole objective, to make it sustainable. What should be done? In many ways, the hardest and most important steps have already been taken, and that is to acknowledge that there is a problem and to have this acknowledged at an elite political level. There were some serious holes in our legislative framework which have been closed up, and now the hard work of just implementing is ahead of us. And one of the most important challenges is how to re-enable an informed public conversation to the extent that it was disabled by these kinds of activities before.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. First is I would like to actually say a few, my opinion about this gentleman's question just now, about how do we educate the politicians in Australia to understand China. Honestly, in my opinion, they do. They understand already. They just don't want to touch it. It's too hard. But how do we tackle the China problem? I think first we need someone who really understands it. I don't think they fully understand. They feel worried. And the reason why they don't want to fully engage because they want the China money. And the China money is making the job very easy. But you know what? Actually, that's very corruptive, as I see it. Because the money coming from China is dirty money. You know, everybody knows that. And they make this country weak because all our manufacturing, everything is dying here. And we just want easy money. So it's wrong. Now, I have a question is for one thing, it's been recently, which everybody knows is called Hung Hu Regard with the opera. And I wrote a letter to the, minister of the, what's called, the art minister, John Howin something, anyway. Anyhow, he replied, he did not reply straight away. And when I caught up again, and he said, oh, I'm going to write you a letter. I said, what do you mean by letter? It's a post to you. I said, how come you don't reply in email? Obviously, as I see the intention to try to delay the reply so they can get it through. So I called up, then I get the Sydney Opera House to reply me straight away in the afternoon by email. And they said that this is not got nothing to do with the Sydney Opera House because this is organized by one, what's that company? Oh, Feng or something. So I got a bit confused. How do we handle this kind of thing? Because honestly, as I see it, what happened in China is got not much to do with me since I'm here now. Honestly, it's wrong. Maybe politically it's wrong. But somebody's annoying that this happened in Australia, which is, they worship Mao in Australia, in the top opera house in Australia. It's a shame. So what can we do? Now, this is like almost the end of the avenue. I said, look, I'm going to find out what we can do. So I would like to know what we can do to, particularly this kind of thing, how can we stop it from happening in the future? And do we have a right really to say that's against our what's called constitution to have a red opera going on in the Sydney Opera House? Thank you.
Oh yeah. It's the Red Guards of Honghu Lake or something along those lines. Yeah, Lake Honghu. Yeah. And it was performed, about a week or two ago at the Sydney Opera House. I mean, I may diverge, from some other people here tonight in that I'm kind of like a free speech fundamentalist, so I just kind of feel like, if that performance is going to go on, it's going to go on. But I was, very much encouraged by seeing people, speaking out about this, going out to protest against it, and making their voices heard. I think that is really all that one can do in dealing with these types of things. And also, of course, organizing not necessarily counter performances, but certainly educational discussions that highlight, the very real issues that emerge from red operas and the political culture surrounding them.
Okay, thank you. I want to use this chance to ask the audience here. I'm speaking this on behalf of Doris Liu, the director of the movie, in the name of Confucius, and she sent me text message said there is educational version of the movie. If the university who likes to have this, and I can give you the link and for classes. And also, I just want to use this time to make some alerts that don't accept any reform or better management of the Confucius Institute. Let we look back to 40 years ago when the economic reform started. I think it was more than 80% of people, was looking forward. But today, many of them are very disappointed and regret because the whole community need to pay 100 times price for the reform. And also, after the Tiananmen Square massacre, many people were being pretty hard to the Chinese Communist Party, but some countries started to be very soft, including Canada. So Canadian government started to have so-called human rights dialogue since 1996, and they said they don't want to, to anger the Chinese government and being very isolated and to close its door again. And now I don't see any good effect. And for example,
Canadian, they trained Chinese lawyers, judges, and social workers for many years. And where are they now? The Chinese law system, they learned from the Western country to do the perfect performance. And they have the judge's head and the clothes, but they need to be a member party, so the party member. And it is much more harsh than 20 years ago. For example, people knows that 300 of the human rights lawyers have been persecuted for the last a few years, right? And before 2008, the Chinese government promised for many, many things, for, of course, especially for the human rights situation to be better in case of the Olympic Games. So 10 years later, the human rights situation is 100 times worse. So be aware of that. Don't accept if the Chinese government, they say, okay, we can make changes and we can make the reform of it, we can have a better management system. No, it's a lie. I just want to mention this. Thank you.
We just get one last question.
I just want to say a couple of things. There are a lot of problems, and I think the general public are aware, as well as politicians and scholars and researchers, we're aware of the problems we're facing. A lot of people are in the position saying, what can we do? Nothing. You know, people become too, I think, you know, like the censorship, Chinese people are suffering the censorship. They have no freedom to think. But here we have given too much freedom for the Chinese communist regime to use our liberal, to use our freedom, to use what is available here, and to pursue their own ambitions. So we got to be aware of this. We can't stop Chinese Communist Party to do what they want to do because it's decided by their nature. They're going to do it anyway. But as Australian society, and we need to be aware where we say no. When do we say no? We have to do things according to our own principles, based on our own terms, not on the Chinese communist regime's terms. So there are a lot of work to be done, and I think today's roundtable is very good, another start, and to encourage people to think and to analyze and probably to do things more constructively. As I said at the very beginning, we don't want to sever the relationship with Chinese people. We don't want to. But we have to be very careful and to actually defend our own principles and not to do things according to the CCP's principle. We can say no. We can say, hang on, if you want to do business with us, if you want to promote Chinese language teaching, okay, you do it our way, not your way. I think that we have the right, and we have the right to do so. And we got to do it. A lot of people take like a self-censorship themselves. Oh, we don't want to upset China. We don't want to upset because money is there. It's our top trading partner. And we just, people just become so, not to want to get involved. But by taking this, we're giving too much leverage. And we have to be very careful. Thank you.
Two questions. The Greens Party, as far as I know, have been leading the charge against the Confucius Institute, and I'm interested in the changes, the legislative changes that you mentioned, John. Who has been driving those changes? Because I hadn't even heard about them. And secondly, in terms of the fact that there's been there's been defunding of universities, so they've been encouraged to find money wherever they can, and not just universities, other institutions. So how much of that is what's driving, so in other words, they take money from wherever, whether it's Confucius Institutes or like the Saudi Arabia government has been funding Islamic studies courses, which is a similar thing because they then try to push their agenda. And it's happened in Britain with schools which have been promoting in Saturday schools are cutting off of hands and so on because they're the ones funding the Saturday schools, so they promote a Wahhabi doctrine. It's very similar, as far as I can see. So shouldn't there be a general scrutiny before people even accept money? And the same happens in school canteens. McDonald's at one stage was pushing their products. So shouldn't there be a responsibility of whoever is taking money that the old saying, he who pays the piper calls the tune? Shouldn't they be looking in advance at where the money is coming from, what are the agenda of who's providing the funds before they take money?
Well, so the legislation was developed by the federal government, and it was developed in the Diligence Committee, bipartisan committee in Parliament. So it ended up being a really interesting collaboration between leading figures in both the Coalition and the Labor Party, as played out on this Intelligence Committee, and after a lot of arm wrestling, they secured a consensus in June this year. I'm not sure where the Greens fell on that final vote. As to your point about outside money and who calls the tune, it's pretty accepted as a university principle that the university sets the rules, that the university appoints the staff, the university determines the research agenda, and certainly the detail of what's done. So the question is whether the universities are, in some cases, persuaded to deviate from their own processes and principles.
What can we expect, say, looking 10 years in the future? Will Australia's liberal democracy extrude the Confucian Institutes out of our society? Or in 10 years' time, will there still be resistance groups trying to do something about them, trying to limit their effect in Australian society? What's your opinion about that? What will happen in 10 years' time?
I don't know what's going to happen in 10 years' time, but my objective, and the objective is not to exclude or shut down Confucius Institutes, it's to ensure that they and other outside funded institutions conform with laws and principles of Australia and the institutions themselves. So in 10 years' time, the Confucius Institutes and other outside funded bodies will either be conforming with Australian principles and laws, or they won't be here.
I think it's time to close our